Welcome folks to SALEStrainer Online, and today we will be discussing Consultative PRöSPECTOR, which effectively is the mode of operation that one uses when talking or working with prospects. So without further ado, I'll just move straight into that space and start to explain to one and all just how the process itself works. Now, for prospecting for a long time, it's been catch and kill, and the idea of prospecting has been locate somebody who is potentially selling and then move them directly into the space of wanting to list. Now, we think that this space has changed, notably, especially around the fact that these days property sellers can research the market and can ascertain information around value of property. And let's face it, I mean, if you go in there on a market appraisal and make the premise of the relationship about what you think the property's worth, then that can be contentious moving forward. So we say in prospecting, what is it that you seek? Do you seek listing presentations, which ultimately lead to listings, or are you seeking market appraisals, which, notwithstanding the fact that they might establish an initial relationship and populate your database, does this then mean that it's going to be listings? Now, I believe that the time that you want to approach somebody is when they are researching ahead of selling, and be focused more on these people, because the line that I use around this is to simply say that there are more sellers that are active in your marketplace than you actually need. So if you can beat a direct line to those prospective sellers, build or identify a relationship, build a relationship in a short space of time, then you're moving into listing presentations. You see, valuers calculate worth. And let's face it, when we talk about comparative value, it is largely subjective. It is still a matter of opinion. And when you're talking to prospective sellers about the worth of the property by way of comparison, you are opening yourself to some sort of debate, or at least, or which might escalate into conflict. Marketers, on the other hand, create value. And as real estate agents, I believe this is our role. Our role is to be marketers and to leverage the value of property beyond compare. Sales professionals ought to be giving advice and not price. I can confidently tell you that, and this is not 100% foolproof, but I can tell you to a degree, if a property owner, a dormant property owner, is seeking a market appraisal, then the likelihood of them wanting to sell is not very high. And at the very least, they're not necessarily an active property seller. Active property sellers are preferring these days to do their research independent of real estate agents. Okay, focus on active property sellers. So I say, if you make your prospecting regime singularly focused on active property sellers and then just utilizing it to one singular 4-letter word. Now, there's been a lot of debate around this, and I say, you know, what defines professionalism? And so often you hear things, you know, like it's appearances and the way something aesthetically looks. But at the end of the day, I believe that professionalism focuses or is centric to one 4-letter word, and that is basically caring, to care. If you care about how you're perceived, if you care about the sellers, if you care about what it is that they're trying to do ahead of the price, that will be received, in my opinion, as professionalism. And I can honestly say, in a professional disposition, that care is interpreted as the value that you can add from the outside. I don't see any value in offering market appraisals. You see, sellers can ascertain this information independent of you. So we say what we need to do is focus on purely active property sellers. Now, this would mean that there's going to be less of them forthcoming, but it also means that your productivity is likely to escalate, given that you are focusing on people that are doing something, if not today, imminently. And care develops trust, and trust is paramount to winning the game of listing and selling real estate. So I say that this is a 4-step process in prospecting. The first step is to identify those active property sellers. Now, we already know where they're frequenting. They are usually in doing their research ahead of selling. They are primarily attending open for inspections of properties that are in the immediate vicinity of their own and running those comparisons. They are calling about those properties that are in the immediate vicinity, and some are seeking information. I mean, just imagine, rather than making it contingent on meeting with an agent, that they were given a comparative market analysis. What would happen instead if you gave them this information freely and surrendered the idea of allowing them to do their own independent research on price, and you could focus professionally on advice? So we say that the first step is to identify. The second step is to then focus on whatever their moving motive may be. Now, I don't necessarily know if it's an investor, they're still selling that property for something else. But in any event, what we need to do is make our conversation, our consultation, centric to the motive. We then need to move into offering valuable consultation and advice, listening to their needs, listening to the motive, and then adding value around the consultation and the advice that we're giving. So the first step in identifying active property sellers, this is the common question. Now, I'd ask you to just be honest, and it might not come out exactly like this, but when you do identify somebody who is potentially selling, is it not fair for me to say that most real estate agents, the next move is to say, would you like me to come down and give you an idea on price, give you an idea on value? Would you like me to come down and see what we might be able to achieve for you? That sort of thing. Now, I say that most of the problems that occur inside of a real estate transaction emanate from how the listing was won at the listing presentation. So if you do win it on price, it becomes about price. If you do win it on fee, it becomes not on fee, and the fee will come back to haunt you. I just say this is simply the wrong way to go about it. You see, we seem to think the price is the paramount issue with a property seller. Now, I'm not saying that it's not, but I can tell you that the price and its importance is directly linked to the motive. And this is what we ought to be focused on. So I say, how do we identify these active property sellers in the first instance? Now, one of the wonderful things that we have is a property seller's research guide. I'm not here to talk about that today, but effectively, can you imagine that you have a guide that shows sellers how to independently research the market ahead of selling? So you sat at the open for inspection, or what we call a welcome home. A seller comes to the door and you just simply say, are you buying or selling? They say, why? I say, well, for sellers, we have a property seller's research guide. If the hand of that prospect comes out and grabs that guide, we can safely assume that they're selling. Now, once we identify them, that next move of then going to, would you like me to come down and give you an idea on price, is the wrong way to go. And we simply have to move forward around this. So I say the next line that you need to use is, So where are you off to or moving to? Or you might say, what are you trying to do or where are you going? We need to identify the motive, and notwithstanding the fact that they might give you the superficial motives, certainly if it's financial trouble, they're not going to reveal that. But at any event, if you then turn the conversation toward the motive, and in many instances with sellers at present, a lot of them, because they can do this research, because they wrongly assume that their property is going to be relatively easy to sell, they tend to want to find something first before moving. This has been exasperated, for example, by the off-market phenomena that with listings that hit the marketplace. They just make this simple assumption that theirs is going to be relatively easy to sell, and worse, they may even consider that the price might be static. Now, one of my favorite lines around that is when a seller reveals the motive, and if they do so, we want to find something first before we put ours on the market, or okay with price, or whatever the case might be, I then move into another space where I simply say to them, you haven't found anything yet, have you? That could be dangerous. Now, if they say, they look at me and they say, why? Sometimes they haven't found anything, they'll still say, why? I say, well, what part of owning two properties at the same time appeals to you the most? In all seriousness, folks, why on earth would somebody want to find and buy a home before selling their house? Now, this can only be spawned out of the fact that they haven't come into contact with a consummate professional that explains to them in a consultative manner the best way to go about the process of selling. So once you've identified them, then you have to focus, or I say that you need to focus, again, on, on valuable consultation and advice. You see, comparative value is effectively based on recent sales history, whereas market value is based upon leverage perceptions. Now, I've said this for a long, long time, that comparative value is not much more than a history lesson. We can't ignore it because it gives us a benchmark, or it gives us a guide as to where value sits. But at the end of the day, comparative value is subject. And despite what agents might say, despite what comparisons might say, properties often sell above and below the comparisons, because to a buyer, no two properties are the same. And where one buyer will see a certain value, another will see a certain value as well. So we say that market value is based upon leverage perceptions. And again, let's face it, this is what sellers sell for. And I believe our primary role as a professional real estate agent is to, in the very first instance, protect the value of a property, ensuring it never sells for less than it could have gotten. And in the second instance, to leverage that value beyond comparison. So when we talk about value, I talk about it in the context of definition rather than being specific around comparative value. So I'll say to an owner, comparative value is not much more than a guide, but market value is what you get. And to be honest with you, the market value that you will receive, its capacity to be leveraged, will be based upon the professional capacity of the professional that you choose. So comparative value, quite simply, is not market value. And we need to make this dissemination, because it's here as real estate agents that we add value to the transaction. Now, the second assumption that a lot of prospective sellers make, active property sellers, during the research phase, is that by listing the property for sale, they are agreeing to sell it. And this is just not true. See, what I say to a seller is, listing is not selling. And in fact, during the life of the listing, you'll be asked to sign two agreements. The first is one that gives me the authority to put the property on the market and explore the opportunities, the buyers, and the offerings that they may put in front of you. The second agreement that you sign will be a contract of sale, and it is only then that you are obligated to sell. Now, just stepping back to what I was just explaining just a moment ago, so just stepping back into what I was explaining just a moment ago, the reality is that when a seller comes to the front door and, you know, of an open for inspection as an example, and we give them the property seller's research guide, excuse me, that's just a little blood from shaving this morning that I had. When a seller comes to the front door and we hit them with that question of, where are you off to? And we give them the property seller's research guide. Then we talk about the matter, where are you off to? And then I say, you haven't found anything yet. If they say that they're looking to find something first, that could be dangerous. They will then say to me, why? I say, well, look, it sounds to me like nobody's shown you the process. Nobody's explained to you how it is that this process works. So what I then focus on is I say to them, look, if you'll shout me a coffee, I'd be happy to come down and show you the safest way to go about this process. Now, this then leads me into the space where I'm able to say, I'm just coming back to the guide here, that listing is not selling, what the process looks like. Now, some of you may never have seen this before, but I believe this is the most successful way for a property seller to go about the process of buying and selling. The very first step they have to do is find a buyer, find someone who will actually buy the property. Yet so often, if they're talking about wanting to find something first, they're one step ahead. Even worse, if they're figuratively in their head already imagine what they'll buy the home at. Now, so often sellers go about, they embark on the process of saying, we've already decided this is what we're going to buy and this is how much we spend. And to do that, this is how much we need at the back. So they match the prices before they've found a buyer and before they've found a home. This is getting entirely ahead of themselves. So as a consultant, as a prospective, being a consultative prospector, what I aim to do is educate the sellers as to the safest way to go about it. Now let's take a look at this. The seller lists their property for sale. And during this time, we're looking to find a buyer. Whilst ever that property is listed, they're out looking to find a home. Now, we go ahead and focus on matching the prices effectively. Now, whilst they're doing this, and whilst we're going through this process, it could break down at any point. If they find a home and they seemingly, given what the buyer has offered, can't get the prices together, then this can be called off. And this is where we try to explain, or I try to explain in consultation, this represents the least amount of financial risk. Let's assume they've gone all the way and they've physically bought a new home. They've already bought it. Now they're putting the property on the market, demanding that their property sell at the price that's been dictated by the fact that they've bought the home. Forget about finding a home, they've already done that. And now they're demanding that you find a buyer that meets their expectation on price. This is where the trouble starts. So a good consultant can explain this properly, gain trust, and when the seller's ready to start to make the move, they put the property on the market first. So I look at them and I say, you know, so they'll say, well, we want to find something. So I then fast forward their thinking. And the simplest way I can do this, I say, what if you do find something? What are you going to do? And they go, we're going to go ahead and buy it. Moving back to that last slide, I say, but now you're running the risk of only 2 properties at the same time. And I say, how would you be if you did find a property to buy? What if you found one? And what if you needed to sell in order to buy it? How would you feel about the prospect of missing out on it, given that you're now not at the ready to sell? Now, this is all being explained before the property's even been listed, ahead of time in consultation, when the pressure is not really on, and I'm showing them some of the risks that they could take. You see, many owners think in terms of what happens now instead of what happens next. So they look at it and they find something they want to buy and they go, well, what happens now? Instead of actually going back to the beginning and saying, this is the plan, this is the safest process. What if, and that's a big off, what if you find something to buy and you can't go ahead because you have no buyer, which I just mentioned a second ago? What are you going to do? And they go, well, we're just going to have to sell our property quickly. Yes. Doesn't that now mean that you are subjecting yourself to a concession in what you could get in value because you now have to make that move in order to secure the other property? The risk versus the return. Now let's look at it. So you say to me, you don't want to take the risk of finding something. Sorry, you want to find something to buy because you don't want to take the risk of having sold before you buy. But buying before selling is a risk that's best left alone because there's no financial sense in owning two properties. In fact, finding something first is a bigger risk than putting your property on the market and making it available with no obligation to sell irrespective of the price it's achieved. So I say finding a buyer before committing to a purchase represents no financial danger, and it is quite simply the way to go. You see how this all adds up to consultation. What about timing restrictions? So I say, if you buy first, if you find something first, irrespective of the fact that you are able to attain bridging finance, that you might have plenty of money to make this move fairly successfully, in any way, shape or form, if you have bought the property, you immediately put yourself on the clock. And by putting yourself inevitably on the clock, that's going to lead to concessions in what you might have achieved at the other end. What about competing buyers? Now, if you're not necessarily in a position to buy without having sold first, and you go out there and you do find something, what if you do find something to buy and so too do other buyers, and it's a popular property, several want to buy it, and you're not at the ready? You need time to sell, the other buyers do not, and they're ready to go. So the prospective seller is going to look at that more favorably than perhaps selling with you. And I say to them, this is the most important point going back to those 4 steps. I'm just quite simply okay with the idea of no. What do I mean by that? If we go through any of those 4 steps, if we find a buyer, even if we're able to then negotiate them to a fabulous price, and you're not able to find a property, I stop the process. If you do find a property and we can't match the prices, we can't get you or enable you to buy comfortably given the price that you are potentially looking at selling for, I can say no. I can call all bets off. So overcome the obligation they feel to sell if you put the work into a buyer. How I articulate this to a seller and say, look, if it gets to that, I'm okay with no. They say, what do you mean? Well, you're worried about having to say no to a prospective buyer because you can't find something and you can't make the money work. That's my job to say that. So will you stop doing my job for me? That is why you employ me, and please take the pressure off yourself in that regard. So I'm perfectly okay with no, I don't want to sell at that price, but I'm not okay with not allowing the market to show what is an offer. And this is basically the space that I'm looking at with you now. I'm trying to get you to understand that we need to allow the market to tell us where we're at so that you can comfortably go out there and make a purchase with no financial risk to yourself. Now, a better sales price. What if you potentially sold, or what if we got a buyer and they paid a runaway price? And all the time you were thinking that your budget is restricted because this is what you think you're going to get based on the comparisons, yet we get a way better sale price than that, which opens up the opportunity to you maybe to go up the price range and get an even better house. Yet if we go about it the way that you're considering now, you're actually putting yourself on the back foot because you've already bought something and now you can't buy a better house given that you've had that runaway price. So the more time you have, the better the options, the better the sales price you achieve. There's no truer word in residential real estate than time, or phrase I should say, than time is money. So the more time you have to sell without pressure, basically, the more opportunity open to you, and the greater the likelihood that you're going to get a better price. And we need to throw at them similar case studies. We need to show them, we need to, in consultation, talk about those people that have made the mistake of going ahead and basically buying before selling, the pressure cooker that they've put themselves into, the anxiety they've suffered, and all of the things that have gone wrong. So the best listers are the great storytellers, and there are more disaster stories of buying before selling than successes. And it's in this instance that you need to use accolades that tell this story. We need to be able to tell them, yeah, these are the scenarios that have come up. Here's what has happened where people, now some of these accolades might be good. Having said that, it's still important for us to be able to demonstrate to them similar case studies that they can immediately support the idea of not putting yourself into a financial vice by committing to buy before selling. Focus on the motive. And this is what I say over and over and over again. You know, basically the reason for distress around moving often relates to some aspect of their move. They're worried about timing with the job transfer. We don't want to get it on yet because we're not likely to move till then. None of these things are really as relevant as the prospect may feel, but need to be discussed in consultation, particularly around the motive. And motives won't be revealed in the first session. They take time for you to discuss them. So if the approach is one where you are freely giving advice, and here's a point I didn't make before that I need to make now, that you are giving that advice without any expectation of listing the property. You need to calm down, because if you become good at identifying sellers, you will be able to identify far more than you need. If you then adopt the disposition of consultation and giving advice rather than price, you'll have plenty of time to delve deeper into the motive. So not only discovering what or where they're trying to go or do, then understanding why they want to do it and what the emotional dominant reason attached to that is. And then they'll start to share with you the deadline where it starts to become way more apparent with what it is. So the other thing that we need to do in consultation is SMS market your results. What do I mean by that? Texting to prospective sellers the sales that you're making, and in particular instances where sellers have found a buyer first and comfortably then gone on and found a house and made the prices work. So text messaging sales results using SALEStrainer mentor templates. Marketing your results will give the seller the right perception of you. So I say we're going to text message these results, and then we're going to use them inside of templates to market it. This will give us a greater perception of how we are engaging in professionalism, which should be consistent with care. And I've said this over and over again that, you know, once you've actually identified somebody who's actively selling or researching the market ahead of selling, you need to delve in and be sending, as you make sales, messages of these sales occurring. Now, they need to be limited. You don't want to be doing these every, you know, I'd say ideally every 72 hours, 48 hours is even compact. Certainly not every day. That just becomes annoying. But that perception of that then takes them into one other place. And then last but not least, you need to keep up the communication. And when I say keep up the communication, as soon as you've identified a seller, you need to understand the process that they're going through. In the first instance, they are running comparisons, trying to ascertain the comparative value. So what we have in our property sellers research guide is a hyperlink that enables them to order a CMA independent of meeting with an agent. Now, some of you might be horrified because you've been trading on that for a long, long time. But I believe if you allow and educate the seller how to arrive at their comparative price, you don't have to engage as a professional in the argument, the subjective argument as to what the value of the property might be. You need to invite them to open homes so they can see how that works, and a whole range of other things that make way more sense than just going down there, giving them a price and making the listing contingent on that. So I hope that session's been very valuable to you. I hope that you can use this. We try to keep this to half an hour to start to make that move into consultation. One of the next session, I'll be very sure to ensure that I explain the property seller's research guide and how this can be a wonderful identification tool, how that you can then move into consultation and focus on the motive, and then fundamentally how you then can demonstrate the value you have as a professional, which then allows them to, which then allows them to see the value in having a consummate professional representing them and showing them how it is that you list and sell real estate. Thank you for joining me, Sales Trainer Online. I'll make this recording available to you, and be very sure to look out for the List and Sell Tour online.